for those of you that was here Wednesday night, I kind of touched on this a little bit, and I kind of decided to follow it a little bit. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel 24 this morning. Justin, you missed out. I threw your name under the bus multiple times Wednesday night. I blamed you for the message that everybody got to hear, because basically I went back to Leviticus and was teaching from Leviticus and Revelation. And but one of the things we talked about was just through Leviticus, and it's your statement, and it made me laugh, and so that's where that whole lesson came from. Was Leviticus is basically to go take a bath because you're nasty. And so I actually followed that out Wednesday night and flushed it out a little bit more than just that statement. But we were talking about the what it was necessary and how lepers are cleansed, and basically how that reflects everything in the Old Testament. And I hope you guys know this. I've got a bunch of mature, and I don't mean mature elderly wise, Terry. I mean mature, scripturally wise people, but you understand that you can see all through the Old Testament, you can see God. And if you can't, then you really need to study harder, because everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus and points to God. And we can take even Leviticus, as crazy as that book can sound, and literally I only went over day 8 of the 8 days that you have to deal with for leprosy. I only did one day, but going through the other 7 is a lot of fun too. But anyway, one of the things I brought up at the tail end was talking about David when he was in the cave. And I started thinking about this the rest of the week, and I guess I started a thought, so I'm not sure how far this is going to go. As most of you know, my notes are usually anywhere from 6 to 10, 12 pages. I've got 3 this morning, so this should be interesting. But anyway, I want to read 1 Samuel 24. I'm going to read kind of sporadically, but I want to talk about this whole thing, and there's something interesting in it that I guess got me to thinking. And as I mentioned Wednesday night, we'd gone to a Bible study at Shiloh last Monday night. And it was talking about our influence that we have as Christians, and talking about the opportunities that we have to tell others about God. And then Tuesday night, we were out at Stacy's birthday dinner, and I had an opportunity and missed it. And it's bothered me. It's bothered me a lot since then. And it was easy for me to feed him. And that part was easy. If you want to go buy you a pizza, you want to buy food, no problem. How many times do we love to do that? But how easy is it to share the gospel? And my brain just wasn't thinking it should have been. And so, anyway, some of this is kind of developed from that. But let's go ahead and read first. 1 Samuel 24 verses 1 and 2 first, and then we're going to kind of get into this just a little bit. And these are just, I think Justin put it here last week, was just some thoughts, and we'll just go from there and see what we can learn. It says, "And it came to pass when Saul returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel, and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats." So in this chapter, we still have David on the run, okay? And I touched on this a little bit Wednesday night, but he's been chosen king, okay? God said, okay, you're going to be my next king. And so he is running, because if you think back and you think of the stories of David and Saul, when David and Saul returned from war, what did they say? Do you remember what they sang? Anybody? Said Saul has killed his hundreds and David has killed his thousands. Yeah. Well, you had jealousy going on, didn't you? And Saul now knows that David's been chosen to lead his people. And so Saul is not happy about this, right? So what is he doing? He's trying to kill David. He's trying to kill David, God's chosen person now. So now Saul's come back from war. A report's been given to him that David's hiding in the wilderness. And so he takes 3,000 men to go hunt down David and the few men that he had with him. In verse 3 it says, and he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And he came to the sheepcotes. Okay. Now, what are the odds of this? A lot of times, and with Beth here, it's kind of funny, but we talk about God giving us a sign, right? And this is kind of where this really came from. But we prayed for a new pastor, and when Kevin left, we immediately started praying that God would send somebody to us. Well, how many times do you ask God to give you a sign, right? So God, just give me a sign, a little sign, something to tell me that this is right. Well, I think God gave us a billboard in this case, but we kept going, well, let's look for that sign. Could you move this billboard, God, so we can see that sign? And I think we did that for a while, because how often does God give you a sign, right? Well, I want to talk a little bit about that here, because now David and his men were hiding out in caves. All right, there's caves all over this area. If you've been to Israel, but if you go into that area and you study the topography of the land and you look, there are caves everywhere. So David hears that Saul's coming after him, so he goes, and him and his men hide in one single cave in this land. And I think in this area, I read somewhere that probably within the radius of where this was, there's 100 to 150 caves, and they hide in one cave. And Saul says, ooh, I need to go in and take care of some needs right now. And he picks one cave. Which cave does he pick? The cave that David's in. The odds of that are ridiculous. But yet, we see God's hand, don't we? And to us, we see a billboard. Here's David, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. I'm Irish all of a sudden. But that woke him up. But anyway, it seems that Saul entered alone, which makes no sense. He entered alone without his protectors to attend his needs. So it was a prime opportunity for David and men. Saul was handed to them on a plate in the darkness of that cave, and with 400 to 600 men ready to rid their enemies. So basically, you've got about 400 men that David has. Now, think of how big this cave is, because you got 400 to 600 men hiding in one cave. And Saul chooses that cave to go in by himself without his guard. I mean, it's almost like that billboard. To David, wouldn't that not be a billboard to you? God is delivering this man into my hands. So how many times do we see those billboards? We don't see them very often. But a lot of times we see signs, and the whole purpose of this today is really for us to understand that sometimes the most obvious answer is not the right answer. And I want us to look at that, because if it were me in this case, would you not think, well, God just delivered this up on a silver platter, let's run with it. And how many times have we made bad decisions, taken the wrong job because it looked like the right thing to do, and yet, as we're going to learn, maybe not always the right time or the right thing. So, verse 4 says, and the men of David said unto him, behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privately. All right, so how many times in those situations do your friends pop up and say, oh, look what God's doing for you. Look, right here it is. God's giving this to you on a silver platter. And David should have, he could have perceived it as a sign from God, and that it was God's will for David to take the life of the Saul. Here it was just laid out for him right in front of him. They even quoted a saying or a psalm that the enemies of David would be delivered into his hands. Now, from the natural, you see how all of this points to one outcome. And yet, you got to think about it from David's perspective. He was being hunted. He had been ran out of his home. Everything that he had was gone. And he was just simply trying to flee and live his life and trying to not be killed. And here God is just saying, here you go. It's what it looked like. And that's how a lot of times in life we get to this point. And we see problems, we see outcomes, and we want God to give us this billboard. But then we see it and we run with it, and instead of really taking the time to look at it and to hear God, we make wrong decisions. Well, let's look at, we know what David did, but we're going to look at it a little bit more. To take Saul's life would end their suffering and would place David on the throne, which is what God said he wanted done, right? So everything points to this being a right decision. However, opportunity does not make a wrong thing right. I think back in my life to several things that I've done, and you think, oh, this is a great opportunity to do this. And then you look at it and you think, well, is it really the right thing to do? And I wish I could say there's been many times in my life that even though it was wrong, I didn't do it. But there's times when I've done it, even when it was wrong. And I've chosen to make bad decisions. We talk about this. We talk about it with my friend's son. He's made every bad decision you could make in life. And just because the opportunity presents itself does not necessarily mean it's right. We as Christians in our walk and in the things that we're doing around here, just because we have opportunity just to be active in the church, and I'm not knocking anybody from working in the church. I want everybody to get busy and work. But don't get so busy that you don't have time for God. Right. Opportunity does not always mean that that's what you're supposed to do. Now, we need workers. We need people who are going to come in here alongside the church and get busy. But if it's taken away from your time to study or taken away from time from your family or even a job situation to where maybe this is not going to be right for me and my family, second shift could have really put a strain, no matter how bad you wanted it, and you know that somewhere down the road you probably moved to first shift, what would that have done to the family? So sometimes opportunity does not always equal the right thing to do. And I love how God does this. He shows us these pictures. He shows us these things. But most of the time, we see opportunity and we stop there and we go with it. Instead of actually praying and saying, God, what is it that you want me to do? And so here, again, for David, it would end his suffering. It would place David on the throne, and it would all be ready to go. Think about, and I think about Job, Jonah. And you think about him going down, and God said, okay, I want you to go over here. And he goes down to the harbor, and all of a sudden here's a boat saying, hey, I'm going to Tarshish. And he's like, well, there's an opportunity. So he jumps on the boat, right? Well, it didn't make it right. It may have been a good opportunity for him to get away from it, but it didn't make it right. So again, we have to make sure that we take a look at this. Many Christians think, as David's men did, that opportunity is a sign from God, but we must be careful that we don't act in haste, but trust God to reveal His will. Now, we were just talking about it in prayer this morning. What is God's will for our lives? Can anybody say what God's will is for their lives? Yeah, it's right there in the Word. God said, go ye into all nations, preach the gospel. That's His will for your life. I'm sorry. It boils down to pretty simple, rudimentary answer right there. We're supposed to go out and tell others about this great commission that God's given us. Now, does He have a will for what we're doing in the church? Sure He does. And we have to pray and we have to study that. But ultimately, what is our God's will? And that is for us to tell the world that what Jesus did for us. And we all have a testimony that can do that. But anyway, David approaches Saul with a dagger in his hand. All he has to do is plunge it. Now, this is David, who is a man of war. Killing somebody is not going to be a big deal to him. He's done this before. All his problems will go away right there. David, however, chooses a different path of that of his men's advice and only cuts the corner of Saul's robe off. Now, I want to look at two ways God tests David in this passage. And again, I guess my own guilt for not Tuesday night not taking an opportunity. And I always love to try to look at how God uses situations like this to help us grow. And so the first is what we do with those who mistreat us. All right, and this is just in this one. But what was David to do, or what was David to do with Saul, who had continuously mistreated him? Should he react in the natural, get even? Do we do that? Do we do it all the time? When somebody mistreats us, what's the first thing we think about doing? Getting even, don't we? Trying to even if it's just in our own mind, we run through that gamut of they did me wrong and I want to get back at them, or boy they said this, and just a simple little something here would be enough to get back at them. We as Christians, we need to expect to be mistreated. God said, or Jesus said, that the world hated him. It's going to hate us too, and so we should. I think the older I get, I'm more surprised by people doing good than I am evil, because I've seen that the world's going to mistreat us. They don't like us, and I'm okay with that. I don't like people. I'm sorry to say that. I'm an outreach and a Sunday school teacher. I'm an ordained minister. I do all these things, but I don't like people because people will let you down. And so it's easy to get into that place to where we want to mistreat or get even with people who mistreat us. How many times, anybody in here ever been burned by anybody before?
Which time?
Yes. So we all see this as a thing. Well, now, here's David. It says that Satan will hate us because of our love for Christ. I mean, we've got to expect these things. But Matthew 5:44 says, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." I hate that verse. I don't like it because it's not in my nature to do this to people. Romans 12:17-21 says, "Repay no evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men." Well, I wish they'd read this. I can live peaceably with anybody, but I wish they would read this. "Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink. For in doing so, you will..." Go ahead. There you go. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Who put this in here? Seriously. This is not how it's supposed to work, is it? So how many times in our lives do we see opportunities to do this very thing, and yet we fail miserably? And as Christians, we've all been to churches to where we've been hurt. We've all been to churches where people have left, and as soon as they leave, you start hearing all this negativity about them throwing bad comments about you or the church or even friends in your life, close friends, and all of a sudden you don't see them for a while. Next thing you know, they're talking about you behind your back, saying things that are not true. We've all been there, every single one of us. But how do we handle this? Well, right here it is. God says even those that do these things to us, that we are supposed to feed them, clothe them, pray for them. Man, if I could heap more coals on their head, I would. But this is the only ones God's given me a reason or a way to do it. So I'll go that route. But I would prefer to actually heap coals of fire on their head. But God wants us to do it this way. So even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing that he was about to be betrayed, called Judas his friend. And you look at that and you think, how can he call him friend, knowing what he's about to do to him? And then I love Peter. Peter is my man. When they came, of course, Peter's first reaction was to defend. And I think a lot of times, I think that becomes natural, defend ourselves. Peter whips out a sword, cuts the dude's ear off, right? And I'm paraphrasing. It's not dude. I don't think dude's in the Bible. But anyway, we know that even in that time, what did Jesus do? healed him. Knowing they're about to take him away and crucify him, knowing what he's about to go through, knowing the torture and the physical pain. And if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, that's one thing. That doesn't come close to what Jesus suffered on the cross. But yet Jesus, knowing all of that was about to take place, still took time to heal his servant. Can you imagine that servant's conversation from that day forward? The testimony that he had, even though he was there to arrest this man, and yet he just gets his ear lopped off and it's laying on the ground, and this guy picks it up, puts it back on the side of his head, says, "Be healed." That man's life was changed from that point on. That's what we're supposed to do. Even when we've been treated poorly, even when things haven't gone the way we want them to, or our friends seem to betray us, when we are kind to them, when we treat them with love and heap those coals of fire, imagine that testimony they have. I think of Stanley through all this, because right now he feels like God's the one betraying him, because he wants his wife to be healed. And it's hard when you feel like your Creator is the one doing the betraying. And I heard him say that night that he feels, what's his word that he uses? Forsaken. And it's hard when you feel like the Creator that loves you is the one that's forsaking you. But yet, imagine the testimony that he'll have when he comes through this. And everybody sees God through this and see him standing stronger on the other side to be able to say, I don't like the outcome. I don't like what happened. But God. When you say that, think of the strength that you have on the other side of this, through whatever you're going through. The second test for David in this event was waiting for God. Well, I'm done. All right. I don't like to wait on anything. We live in a fast food world, don't we, where we expect everything. I mean, I'm mad when Amazon doesn't ship something in 2 days for free. So, I mean, we've all gotten into that mentality. And yet, here it is, we're supposed to wait on God. Well, again, who puts this in here?
Right.
I mean, seriously, this is stuff that doesn't compute for us nowadays. So, will David wait for God to act and bring about his promises, or will David act? David had been anointed king, yet he finds himself running, hiding, and persecuted by Saul. Yet, here in front of him is a choice, to rid himself of his enemy or to wait for God to act on his behalf. We all have to learn to wait on God. Abraham and Sarah, did they wait on God? Well, they did, but they really messed up, didn't they? Because they decided, well, we don't want to wait. And so they went and found Hagar, and they jumped the gun. Now, had they just waited on God, things would have turned out better. If David had listened to his men, he would have seized the throne by murder. That's not what God intended. So, he had to wait for God. The 3 steps to rest, I like this. And this was me. This is part of why all this came about, besides him. 3 steps to rest are to commit, trust, and wait. If you look in Psalms 37, 5-9, it says, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. He shall bring forth your righteousness as the light and your justice as the noonday. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him." Ugh. "Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret, it only causes harm. For evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth." 1 Samuel 24:5 says, And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. David's heart had convicted him even for touching the king, because that was just something he didn't do. He had only cut off a little piece of the corner of his clothes, but David felt remorse for that because it showed a sign of disrespect to the king. And even in that gesture where he could have taken the throne, he felt bad about it. This shows David's heart toward God in small things. How many of us would have felt guilty for that? he used it to where he said, look, Saul, I could have killed you. I didn't kill you, but I could have killed you. And we wouldn't have thought anything about that. But even in David's heart, he knew that doing that one little thing was disrespectful. And that shows his heart toward God in the small things. And we need to understand that sometimes even those small things are sin. That we miss the mark by doing even that little thing. It had a point to it, but was it right to do? And even David here in that one little thing where he could have taken his life, but all he did was just cut off a little corner. Even then, David felt that he knew he had done wrong there, and he felt guilty about it. This would have seemed small in the eyes of David's men, but for David it brought conviction that he was wrong. David's heart was right. This is the Lord's anointed, and I am wrong. This was who God had anointed for the time being, and until Saul would either step down or died, then David was supposed to wait. How many times do we get ahead of God? And even something simple like this, we do something so simple, but do we have remorse for it? Do we even think about it? Again, we need to wait on the Lord. The words we use to cut somebody's down are character. Have you all ever done that? I'm guilty of it. When people hurt me, it's easy for me to say something about them. Even if it's just, and I've tried for years to talk with my family. If I don't know somebody and you introduce them to me, just not personally introduce them, but you tell me about them, but the first thing you do is tell me something negative about that person. When I meet that person, guess what? That's what I'm thinking. How many times do we do that? Hey, this guy I work with, he cheats on his wife. He does this. Has he done anything to me? No. But yet, the first time I meet him, that's exactly what I think of him. How many times do we do that as Christians? How many times do we do that to our friends, to people that our family don't even know yet? We've said something negative about them. We've torn down their character before somebody else even has a chance to meet them and draw their own conclusion. So we just need to be careful. Do we cut off little pieces of people in positions above us? All of these acts are in the flesh and they're sin. And verse 6 says, and he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. Let's go on and read. So David stayed his servants with these words and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. David also arose after him and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. And David said, and you see that? He could have killed him, but now what's he done? He's bowed to him because he still is king. And David said to Saul, wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, behold, David seeketh thy hurt. Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how the Lord hath delivered thee today into my hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee, but mine eye spared thee. And I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. David showed mercy and grace here. Wow, I couldn't even get through 3 pages. This is bad. But this shows the outworking of mercy and grace in David's life. Saul was convicted by David's grace. He sees grace in action. When we do these things, when we do what we're supposed to do, when we show mercy and grace to other people, it affects them. Saul, finally, all his life he'd been told that David was seeking the throne, that David was out to kill him. And yet David showed God's actions here. He showed that he had no intentions or ill intentions towards Saul. Because if he had, he could have killed him. We need to do this with people around us. Basically, where's the cross in this passage? Mistreatment comes to all of us. How do we respond to mistreatment? That's the question here. David had to die to himself to get or to his self-will, or to get even or even pay Saul back. He had to die to self to exalt himself and place himself on the throne. He trusted God and allowed him room to act in his time for his will in the life of David. So you look at this, David could have acted on his own. Could have not really listened to God, and he could have moved in a way that would have gotten him exactly what God told him he's going to get. But yet, he chose to wait. He chose to treat him with respect. And when we do that, you got to know it had an impact on Saul's life. And so that's what we're supposed to do in life. And I don't know if somebody's been mistreating you here this week. I don't know if y'all have run into this. Not 100% sure why this was the one we chose this morning. But I pray that we can be better as Christians about how we treat others, even in the church, and how we have an effect, an influence on other people around us, just in the way that we endure some of the trials and tribulations that we go through. So let's just pray and be dismissed, and we'll go out.